This is a test of the educational philosophy broadcast system. Hey, did you hear the one about how there's only a handful of people left in the entire world who don't yet have their own podcast or YouTube channel? Well, I think those days are over because now that we're all stuck at home, even those last few holdouts will be vlogging. So count me in. I'm here sending you a video message. Seriously, some of us in the Lynch school thought it might be a good time to reach out in this weird time when we're all dispersed. So I wanted to just share about a passage that is important to me. One that I've always found interesting and is starting to take on new meanings in this time that we're in right now. It comes from a thinker named Michael Oakshott. You'll see a little bit about him on the slide. I'm going to share the first sentence of the passage, and then I want to just riff off that for a while and sort of unpack what he might be getting at, and then toward the end, I'll share the rest of the passage and we'll see how it sounds. So here's the first sentence. Oakshott writes, "The characteristic gift of a university is the gift of an interval." Now, when I first read that, maybe like you right now, I thought, what is he talking about? The gift of a what? But something about that phrase clicked with me. It resonated, and I kept thinking about it, kept reading and trying to puzzle through what he might mean. So let's start with this question. What is an interval? It's not a beginning, that much is clear. It's not an end. It also started to occur to me, though, it's not really a middle, right? Because a middle would just be continuing from beginning to end, where an interval suggests somehow that there's a suspension of our normal mode of being in time. A different time has started in the interval. I think of a sort of a halftime period at a sporting event where suddenly there's 20 minutes or what have you that has a whole different logic. You run to the bathroom, you grab a snack, maybe the people are playing some kind of game to win t-shirts or something like that. And then we're back to the main event. So it's not just 20 minutes in the middle of some 2-hour event. It's kind of its own time. And that's the sort of thing that Oakshott is getting at. He is suggesting that undergraduate education is an episode in our lives that has its own distinctive logic. Now, this might sound strange because after all, you might say, if there's one thing I'm familiar with by the time I get to college, it's the logic of schooling. Because you may have started schooling at the age of 4 or 5. You've been at it for more than a dozen years by the time you get to college. So how is that new? How could that be a new logic? The temporality of our lives throughout our first couple decades is entirely defined by school. Homework, grades, credits, diplomas. That's what we do, right? But here's the thing. What Oakshott is saying is that's not actually education. Schooling has a value, but it's not education. What's he trying to say there? Well, as you see in this next slide, in an earlier part of that same essay, Oakshott stresses that a university does not, quote, confuse education with training for a profession, with learning the tricks of a trade, with preparation for future particular service in society, or with the acquisition of a kind of moral and intellectual outfit to see him through life. Whatever an ulterior purpose of this sort makes an appearance, education, which is concerned with persons, not functions, steals out the back door with noiseless steps. Education, Oakshott says, is concerned with persons. Now, in particular, what he means is that it's concerned with how we make sense of ourselves, the world, and our place in it. Education's about trying to understand what you're made of and what's worth striving for. But wait a minute, by the time one arrives at college, doesn't one already have a sense of self-understanding, maybe a rich one at that? What's wrong with the self-understandings that people bring from home? Well, maybe nothing, but Oakshott does have 3 worries about them. So let's review those 3 worries. The first is that our initial self-understandings are inevitably provincial. It doesn't matter if you're from Paris or Provincetown. We're all provincial. We inherit the prejudices of our time and a peculiar set of ideas about what matters and why. But we can't see those limits unless we encounter some rival ways of making sense of how to put together a life worth living. Here's a passage from Oakshott. This one is from A Place of Learning. He captures in his poetic way this idea. He writes, Each of us is born in a corner of the earth and at a particular moment in historic time, lapped round with locality. But school and university are places apart where a declared learner is emancipated from the limitations of his local circumstances and from the wants he may have happened to have acquired, and is moved by intimations of what he has never yet dreamed. So this is the first worry, is that our self-understandings have a narrowness to them, and we need exposure to something wider. Now, you might think, okay, but most of us leave our literal hometowns, and we evolve in our worldviews. So why is he worried that we'll be fixed in place? His worry is that even though your worldview expands, and even though you do literal travel, you might still be sort of stuck on that island, that philosophical island, thinking about yourself and your place in the world within that one framework. It's kind of like how people could sing lots of different tunes and only be in one key. What Oakshott's interested in is people learning how to modulate to a different kind of philosophical key. And what he's specifically worried about is that all of our schooling tends to be, education, it can even be forms of higher education, tends to be what he calls instrumental, meaning it's learning that helps us understand how to get what we already happen to have learned to want in our corner of the earth. And at some point, all of this instrumental learning keeps begging a question that we sense we need to ask. And what he calls liberal learning is the chance to finally ask that question. And the question is, what's worth wanting in the first place? Wanting to do, to have, to be, to become. What's worth wanting? That's the question that kicks off liberal learning. So Oakshott's first worry is that we're provincial. His second worry is that instrumental learning will absorb all of our educational time, and we won't even know that we're stuck sort of in the same place philosophically. And his third worry is that our self-understandings that we bring from home aren't quite ours yet. We need to make them more fully or truly our own through a process of examination, through owning them. So confronting the question of what's worth wanting doesn't mean you necessarily jettison what you brought from home. Far from it. I mean, a lot of the people I most admire are people who expanded their horizons but never abandoned their roots. So I have an example. I think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in this regard because she said something interesting. She said that she's lived her whole life by a philosophy that her mother taught her when she was young. So this would have been in the 1940s. She was born in 33, maybe even in the 30s. Her mom told her that there are two principles by which she wanted young Ruth to live her life. One, always be a lady. Two, strive to be independent. Now, what's interesting about that advice given in the 30s and 40s is that there's a contradiction built into those two pieces of advice. To be a lady at that time was to be dependent. So you can imagine a lesser person jettisoning one piece of that advice, or ignoring the contradiction, or maybe just laughing the whole thing off with the condescension of the young toward the previous generation. But not RBG. RBG instead devoted her entire life, first as a lawyer, later as a justice, to pushing society to a place where now we can say that contradiction is at least partly dissolved. So you can stay true to your roots. The question is, do you live in some kind of open-minded relation to what you inherited from your past and what that means? All right, so let's get back to this idea of the interval. So we arrive at college, and we might think, actually, we're at the end of a process, end of a process of schooling. Maybe all we need is 4 more years of, I'll call it studenting, before we hit the job market. Or maybe it marks the end of schooling and the beginning of a new phase of professional education. We could think of our college major as just the first step toward a degree and a career, and maybe graduate education, professional school. Oakshott sees the matter differently. As we said, he sees university education neither as a beginning nor as an end. He sees, in fact, that our early years and our later years have a kind of similarity. No one denies that a 15-year-old, say, and a 35-year-old, their lives are obviously different. Their ways of thinking are different. But what Oakshott sees are some important similarities. For example, in both those phases of life, he sees the pressures of socialization, of performing a role, of trying to define yourself in terms of social roles and categories. On the slide here, you'll see David Shrigley's take on socialization, which I like. Secondly, Oakshott sees us in both phases of life suffering from the tyranny, I'll call it the tyranny of the things to do list. We're driven by necessity. Now, ever since the ancient Greeks, we've recognized that there is an important side to us that we only get to see when we're finally released from the yoke of necessity. The Greeks called this state skole, which is basically impossible to translate. It's typically translated as leisure, but that's kind of problematic because nowadays we hear this word as the opposite of labor, right? We grind at something, work, schoolwork, grinding for hours, and then we just want to unplug our brains and binge the latest show. Now, by the way, one of the all-time ironies is that when we created this modern institution known as the school, we chose that ancient Greek word as our inspiration. And that word school is etymologically linked to skole. Whereas what could be further really from leisure than our modern system of schooling, which basically is the grind incarnate. So the point is, skole is not the opposite of labor. It's the opposite of the labor-leisure distinction itself. Here's how Oakshott makes this point. Quote, "We who belong to no leisured class have been freed for a moment from the curse of Adam, the burdensome distinction between work and play." All right, I think it's about time now that I start wrapping this up, and I think we're ready to hear the rest of this passage that I've been promising. Now we have some ways of understanding Oakshott's philosophy of education. Let's hear how that passage plays out. Oakshott writes, "The characteristic gift of a university is the gift of an interval. Here is an opportunity to put aside the hot allegiances of youth without the necessity of at once acquiring new loyalties to take their place. Here is a break in the tyrannical course of irreparable offense, a period in which to look around upon the world and upon oneself without the sense of an enemy at one's back or the insistent pressure to make up one's mind, a moment in which to taste the mystery without the necessity of at once seeking a solution. And all this, not in an intellectual vacuum, but surrounded by all the inherited learning and literature and experience of our civilization. Not alone, but in the company of kindred spirits. Not as a sole occupation, but combined with the discipline of studying a recognized branch of learning. And neither as a first step in education, for those wholly ignorant of how to behave or think, nor as a final education, to fit a man for the day of judgment, but as a middle. This interval is nothing so commonplace as a pause to catch one's breath. No young man or woman, I take it, would say, thank you for an opportunity of that sort. It is not the cessation of activity, but the occasion of a unique kind of activity." So there's the passage, and in closing, I'll just say that I think what makes our lives so strange right now is that our whole society has been thrown into, like it or not, a kind of hiatus, a strange, suspended state, perhaps even an Oakshottian interval. But at the same time, we've lost our campus for a while. We've lost the spaces and practices by which we sought to remind ourselves that we were more than role performers, that life was more than checking things off our things to do list. Many of you now find yourselves back at home, back in the very places you left to undertake these adventures of self-understanding at BC. And what a strange state we find ourselves in, walls closed in, while time stretches out anxiously and uncertainly, indefinitely. I wonder, though, perhaps this absurd situation, you could almost call it a pause and an interval, is a good vantage from which to take fresh stock of where we have come from, where we're headed, and what practices of teaching and learning mean to us. If nothing else, I wanted you to know that there are others out there, perhaps like you, others who are keen for the adventure to continue and stubborn enough to make sure that that adventure does continue, come what may. Thank you.